Somewhere on a university research bench right now, there is a custom-built operating system running on a MacBook, doing nothing except quietly poking at Apple's silicon in ways Apple never intended anyone outside the company to do. It was built because the researchers got tired of relying on guesswork to understand what is actually happening inside the chip. And what they found was not a bug in an app. It was not a setting you can toggle off. It was a flaw baked directly into the physical architecture of the processor itself, sitting there since the very first M1 shipped, invisible the entire time, because nobody had the tools to look for it until now. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what was found, how deep it goes, why Apple has stayed almost completely silent about it, and why the security researchers who keep uncovering these issues are increasingly frustrated with a company that would rather sue the messenger than fix the message. Quick word before we start. I have spent years tracking silicon security research specifically. The side channel papers, the BootROM disclosures, the exploit write-ups that get quietly deleted after a legal threat lands. That is the lens for this video. I will be precise about what is confirmed by named researchers and published papers, and what is informed reading between the lines. I will not blur the two. Let's get into it. To understand why this story matters, you need to understand what makes Apple Silicon different from almost anything else in consumer hardware, and why that difference is exactly what created the problem. Apple's M-series and A-series chips are custom designed, deeply integrated, and famously closed. Apple does not publish detailed microarchitecture documentation the way Intel or AMD historically have. For years, that secrecy was treated as a security feature in itself. The logic being that if attackers cannot even see how the chip works internally, they cannot find weaknesses to exploit. For a long time, that argument mostly held. Apple Silicon earned a real reputation, deserved in many respects, for strong security engineering. But secrecy is not the same thing as safety, and a group of MIT researchers eventually decided to test that assumption directly. Rather than reverse engineering behavior indirectly through macOS, which adds layers of software behavior on top of the raw hardware and obscures what the chip is actually doing underneath, they built their own bare metal operating system from scratch, one designed purely to talk to Apple's processor directly and observe its true behavior with nothing standing in the way. That is an extraordinary amount of engineering effort just to get an honest look at a chip. And when they got that honest look, they found something Apple's own security documentation had never disclosed. What they found falls into a category of hardware bug called a microarchitectural flaw. Not a mistake in code, but a mistake in the physical design of how the processor handles data during high-speed operations like in speculative execution, the technique modern chips use to guess what instruction is coming next and start working on it before they are sure in order to run faster. This is the exact same category of bug that produced Spectre and Meltdown back in 2018, two vulnerabilities that forced a total rethink of how the entire chip industry approaches performance versus security. Apple was not immune to that lesson learned nearly a decade ago. It just took this long and this much custom tooling for outside researchers to prove it. Here is where this stops being a one-off story and starts being a pattern, because the M1 disclosure was not an isolated incident. It was the third major hardware-level flaw to surface in Apple Silicon in a relatively short window, and each one exposes a different weak point that outside researchers had to go looking for, because Apple's own disclosures never got there first. Start with SLAP and FLOP, two related side-channel vulnerabilities first reported through Bleeping Computer and affecting devices running M2 or A15 chips and onward, which, practically speaking, means a huge share of iPhones, iPads, and Mac laptops and desktops currently in active use. These are not software bugs that a security update can simply patch away in the traditional sense. They are hardware flaws in how the CPU behaves, and they work by measuring things like power consumption, timing patterns, and even subtle electromagnetic signals to infer what a device is doing, specifically targeting information from open browser tabs. That means passwords, banking session data, and other sensitive information displayed in a tab you have open right now could theoretically be inferred by an attacker who understands how to read those signals. Coverage on this explicitly noted Apple had not meaningfully addressed the underlying hardware threat at the time of reporting, even after the flaws were made public. Then there is US Blighter 8, arguably the most alarming of the three because of how it was handled afterward. A European offensive security research firm called Paradigm Shift published a detailed technical breakdown of a BootROM exploit affecting Apple's A12, A13, and related S4 and S5 chips, the silicon inside the iPhone XR, iPhone XS, iPhone 11, iPhone SE2, several iPad models, 2 generations of Apple Watch, and the HomePod Mini. The flaw combines a genuine hardware defect in the USB controller with a firmware configuration issue, and it lives at the BootROM level, meaning it runs before iOS even finishes loading. Before any of the software-side security protections most people assume are protecting them ever wake up. Researchers describe this as sitting in immutable code, the part of the chip that literally cannot be patched after the fact, because it is burned into the silicon at manufacture. Once it ships, it is permanent for every single device that ever used that chip. Independent security discussion around the broader class of Apple silicon flaws has been notably blunt about what this means going forward. One assessment put it plainly: Apple's engineers are excellent, but the complexity of these processor cores is now so high that dozens of similar speculative execution class bugs have already surfaced on AMD and Intel architectures over the years, and Apple was never going to be a permanent exception to that trend just because its chips were newer and more closed off from outside scrutiny. The consensus among people who actually study this category of vulnerability is that this is not the last one. It is one entry in a list that keeps growing. It is worth pausing on why these three flaws in particular took so long to surface, because the answer is not that Apple's internal teams are careless. It is closer to the opposite problem. Apple's chip design process is famously compartmentalized, with different engineering teams often working on isolated pieces of the architecture without full visibility into how their piece interacts with every other piece under adversarial conditions. That is a completely normal way to organize a hardware program of this scale, and most of the time it works fine. But it means the kind of holistic, cross-cutting adversarial testing that surfaces a subtle timing-based side channel is exactly the kind of testing that falls into the gap between teams, unless someone is specifically tasked with trying to break the whole system rather than validate their own piece of it. Outside academic researchers, with no internal deadline pressure and no ownership over any single component, are frequently the ones positioned to actually run that kind of adversarial whole system testing, which is precisely why MIT's From Scratch operating system project succeeded where internal validation apparently had not, at least not publicly. And here's the part of the story that should genuinely frustrate anyone who cares about responsible disclosure. Roughly a month after Paradigm Shift first published its research on US Blighter 8, the firm removed its own blog post entirely. Not voluntarily, but after being sued by a digital forensics company whose business is built partly around using exactly this kind of vulnerability to unlock devices for law enforcement and other paying clients. Reporting on the lawsuit noted the exploit affects a device base that is still enormous. Estimates cited put roughly 1 in 5 to 1 in 4 iPhones actively in use as of mid-2026 as iPhone 11 series or earlier, meaning tens of millions of real, currently owned devices sit on a permanently unpatchable flaw that the public can no longer read the full technical details of because the researchers who found it got legally pressured into taking it down. Think about what that actually means. The vulnerability does not go away because the blog post did. The only thing that changed is that ordinary people trying to understand their own risk lost access to the clearest public explanation of it, while firms with the resources to license or reconstruct that research on their own presumably still can. That is not a technical failure. That is a transparency failure, and it is the kind of outcome that makes security researchers deeply cynical about disclosing anything publicly in the first place. Because doing the responsible thing, publishing clearly, citing your methodology, naming the affected hardware precisely, is exactly what got this specific research pulled from the internet. Before I get into what Apple has actually said publicly about all of this, and why the silence itself has become the story, I want to ask one thing. If this is the layered, sourced version of what's happening inside Apple Silicon security research that you are not getting from a 30-second tech headline, hit subscribe and turn on notifications right now. New Silicon-level research drops constantly, and most channels cover it exactly once, the day the headline breaks, and then never follow the story again. I'm tracking every one of these disclosures, every legal response, every quiet patch note with the same depth. Stay subscribed so you are not 3 weeks behind the next one. Here is what makes this story frustrating rather than just alarming. The near total silence from Apple's own public communications compared to the volume of independent research piling up around its chips. Apple has, to its credit, historically been fast and thorough with software-side security patches once a vulnerability is confirmed and responsibly disclosed through its official channels. That reputation is real, and it is earned. But a hardware-level flaw baked into immutable BootROM or a microarchitectural side channel issue baked into the physical transistor layout is a fundamentally different category of problem. You cannot patch your way out of a mistake in the silicon itself. The only real fixes are workarounds at the software layer that reduce but do not eliminate the risk, or waiting for the next generation of chips to be designed differently, which does nothing for the roughly quarter of active iPhones running hardware from 2018 and 2019 that will never get a new chip. And on that specific point, Apple's public messaging has been thin. Reporting on the slap and flop disclosures explicitly noted, Apple had not meaningfully addressed the underlying hardware threat even after the research went public. There was no dramatic keynote acknowledgement, no dedicated security bulletin walking through mitigation steps in the plain language ordinary users could act on. The default posture, from the outside looking in, has consistently been to let independent security outlets carry the explanation, while Apple's own communications stay focused on the next product launch. That silence reads very differently depending on who you ask. From Apple's side, there's a defensible argument buried in there. Publicly amplifying every hardware-level finding risks handing attackers a roadmap while doing little for users who cannot upgrade their silicon anyway, and drawing more attention to an unpatchable flaw does not make anyone safer. From the security research community's side, the read is much harsher. Multiple researchers working in this exact space have pointed out in comment threads and technical write-ups that Apple's famously closed documentation policy is precisely what forced MIT to build an entire custom operating system just to get a clear look at how its own chips actually behave. If the company had published clearer internal documentation from the start, independent verification would not require this much reverse engineering effort in the first place, and problems like the M1 flaw might plausibly have surfaced years earlier, through ordinary academic scrutiny instead of a multi-year custom tooling project. There's also a commercial angle to the silence that is worth naming directly, even though it requires reading between the lines rather than pointing to a single confirmed internal document. Apple Silicon has been one of the single biggest marketing wins of the last several years. The pitch that Apple's own custom chips are simply better, faster, and more secure than anything a third party could build for a general-purpose operating system. Every hardware-level disclosure chips away at that specific pitch, not because any one flaw is catastrophic on its own, but because the cumulative pattern, M1, then slap and flop, then USB Lighter 8, 3 separate hardware-level issues surfacing across 3 different chip generations in a relatively tight window, starts to look less like isolated bad luck and more like a structural feature of how fast and how secretively this silicon program has been run. Let's get practical for a moment, because the point of a story like this is not just to be alarmed by it, it is to actually understand your real exposure. For the vast majority of people reading headlines about this, the realistic risk today is low. These are not the kind of flaws that get casually exploited by opportunistic attackers scanning the internet at scale. Side-channel attacks like slap and flop typically require a level of access, sophistication, and specific targeting that puts them mostly in the realm of nation-state actors, dedicated corporate espionage, or highly resourced criminal groups, not the average person's day-to-day threat model. The USB Lighter rate. BootROM flaw is more concerning specifically in the context of physical device access, meaning if your phone is lost, stolen, or seized, the exploit becomes far more relevant because it lowers the barrier for someone with the device in hand to bypass protections that would otherwise hold. That distinction matters enormously and gets flattened by clickbait headlines constantly. A flaw that requires physical possession of your specific device is a very different risk than a flaw that can be triggered remotely over the internet. Nothing disclosed so far in this specific wave of research crosses into that second, more dangerous category. But lower risk than the headline implies is not the same thing as no risk. And it is definitely not the same thing as Apple has this fully handled, because the reporting record so far simply does not support that conclusion for the hardware-level issues specifically. The uncomfortable structural reality underneath all of this is that as chips get faster, they get more complex. And as they get more complex, the surface area for exactly this category of subtle, physically baked-in flaw increases rather than decreases. Spectre and Meltdown taught the entire chip industry that the pursuit of raw performance through techniques like speculative execution creates security trade-offs that are extraordinarily difficult to fully eliminate without giving up some of the speed gains those techniques exist to deliver in the first place. Every chip maker, not just Apple, is still living inside that trade-off nearly a decade later. Apple's specific version of the problem is compounded by how closed its documentation has historically been, which is exactly why it took a custom, from-scratch operating system built by outside academics to find what internal red teaming apparently had not caught, or at minimum had not disclosed. Zoom out from the individual technical findings for a second, because there's a broader story here about how security research and corporate silence interact, and it goes well beyond Apple specifically. The lawsuit that forced Paradigm Shift to pull its USB Lighter 8 research down is, in a lot of ways, the more important story than the vulnerability itself. It sets a precedent that responsible, technically rigorous public disclosure of a real hardware flaw can be met with legal pressure strong enough to erase the disclosure from public view, even when the underlying vulnerability itself remains completely unpatched and continues to affect tens of millions of active devices. That should worry you regardless of which company's silicon you personally use, because the entire responsible disclosure ecosystem that security research depends on only works if researchers feel safe publishing what they find. Every time a lawsuit succeeds in scrubbing legitimate technical research from the internet, it makes the next researcher slightly more likely to quietly walk away instead of publishing, or to publish anonymously in places far harder for ordinary users to ever find or verify. And here's the part that connects directly back to the engineers this story is actually about. The people doing this research at MIT, at Paradigm Shift, at the security labs that first flagged SLAP and FLOP are not attackers. They are the people whose entire job is finding these problems before the people with bad intentions do. When that work gets met with silence from the manufacturer and legal threats from unrelated third parties, the message that sends to the next generation of hardware security researchers is not subtle. It tells them the safest career move is to stay quiet. And quiet is exactly the opposite of what actually protects the tens of millions of people carrying this hardware around in their pockets every single day. There is a broader industry lesson buried in here too, and it applies well beyond any single company's silicon roadmap. Spectre and Meltdown were supposed to be the wake-up call that permanently changed how chipmakers balance speed against security. And in fairness, it did change quite a lot. Mitigation techniques standard today did not exist before 2018. But nearly a decade later, 3 separate hardware-level disclosures surfacing in a tight window on one of the most scrutinized, most premium silicon programs in the entire industry is a pretty clear signal that the lesson was absorbed, not solved. Complexity keeps climbing, performance pressure keeps climbing with it, and the honest state of the industry right now is that nobody, including Apple, has found a way to fully close that gap. What separates a company handling that reality well from one handling it poorly is not whether flaws exist. They always will, in every sufficiently complex processor ever built. It is how transparently the company communicates about them once independent researchers find them, and by that specific standard, the record over the last year has been thin. 2 quick things before you go. First, if this gave you the fuller, sourced picture of what is actually happening inside Apple silicon security research right now, share it with someone who still believes closed hardware automatically means safer hardware. That assumption is doing a lot of quiet work in a lot of people's heads, and it deserves to be tested against what the actual research says, not just the marketing. Second, I want to know what you think in the comments. Does Apple owe users a clearer public statement specifically on the hardware-level flaws, even knowing some of them cannot be fully patched? And do you think the lawsuit against Paradigm Shift sets a precedent that will make future researchers less willing to publish what they find? Drop your take below. I read every comment, and if this was worth your time, hit like before you go. Here is where this stands. MIT researchers built an entire custom operating system from scratch just to get an honest, unfiltered look at how Apple's M1 chip actually behaves at the hardware level, and what they found was a microarchitectural flaw that had been sitting undisclosed in the silicon since the chip's original launch. That was not an isolated finding. SLAP and FLOP, 2 side-channel vulnerabilities affecting M2 and A15 chips and onward, expose data from open browser tabs through the physical behavior of the processor itself, and reporting has noted Apple has not meaningfully addressed the underlying hardware threat. The USB Lighter 8. BootROM exploit affects a wide range of older but still widely used Apple silicon, sits in permanently unpatchable immutable code, and was pulled from public view after the researchers who disclosed it were sued by a digital forensics firm. Even though the flaw itself remains live on tens of millions of active devices, Apple's public response across all 3 findings has been largely silent, leaving independent security researchers and outlets to carry the explanation, while the underlying commercial pitch of Apple silicon, as simply definitively more secure, keeps running in the background uncontested. None of this means panic is the right response. Realistic risk today remains low for most ordinary users, and the more serious findings generally require physical device access rather than remote exploitation. But the pattern across 3 separate hardware generations, combined with a legal effort that successfully erased public research on an unpatched flaw, is exactly the kind of story that deserves more scrutiny than a single day's headline cycle ever gives it. Stay locked in, because the researchers digging into this are not stopping, and neither am I.